What if I told you that one of the most famous executive orders in American history, the embargo on Cuban goods, was signed only after the president made sure he had his personal supply of Cuban cigars safely tucked away?
Welcome to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, where every episode takes you deeper into the stories, traditions, and flavors that make cigars and spirits unforgettable. So pour a glass, light a stick, and settle in.
It sounds like a joke. It sounds like legend. But this story, told by the people who were there, is one of those remarkable little intersections of politics and pleasure. And it all comes down to 1,000 Petit Coronas, a single night in Washington, and John F. Kennedy's love for cigars. Kennedy wasn't a man you'd often see with a Churchill hanging from his lips. His taste was more refined, even restrained. He favored the Upmann Petit Corona, a short Cuban smoke that was modest in size but rich in flavor. Friends said he enjoyed their balance and consistency. They were portable, reliable, and elegant. Much like the man himself, unlike Winston Churchill, whose cigar was practically a stage prop, Kennedy's cigars were personal. They were rituals stolen between meetings, quiet indulgences after long strategy sessions, or social cues at private dinners. One White House guest remembered an evening when music had finished playing in the East Room. A group of men retreated upstairs, waiting politely until Kennedy reached into his pocket, unwrapped a cigar, and lit it. Only then did the others follow his lead. His cigar was a signal. The work was over, the company could relax. Cigars, to Kennedy, were not just tobacco, they were ceremony. But the backdrop to that private enjoyment was anything but relaxing. In 1961 and 1962, Cuba dominated the American imagination. Fidel Castro had seized American-owned property, aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and turned a Caribbean neighbor into a Cold War flashpoint. The U.S. government had already begun rolling out trade restrictions. Sugar imports were halted. U.S. aid dried up. By early 1962, pressure had mounted for a full embargo. The political stage was set. Punish Castro, choke the Cuban economy, and send a message to Moscow. Inside the White House, aides debated details. Would cigars be exempt? After all, Cuban tobacco was world-renowned, and Americans loved it. But cigar manufacturers in Tampa lobbied hard against an exemption, insisting that allowing Cuban cigars would crush the domestic industry. The decision was made. Cigars would not be spared. And that's when the famous story begins. One evening, Kennedy called in his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, and asked him, "Pierre, can you get me a lot of cigars?" Very quickly, Salinger, slightly puzzled, asked how many. Kennedy's reply, "About 1,000 Petit Upmanns." The order was clear. Salinger rushed into Washington, visiting every tobacconist he could find. He pulled strings, called in favors, and by morning had secured more than 1,200 of Kennedy's favorite Cubans. When he reported back, Kennedy asked, "How did you do?" Salinger replied, "Very well, sir." Kennedy smiled, reached into his desk, pulled out a long sheet of paper, and signed it. That paper was Proclamation 3447, the order making the Cuban trade embargo official. At 12:01 a.m. on February 7, 1962, the embargo took effect. We'll be right back with how this single act reshaped the cigar world and why Kennedy's quiet indulgence still echoes through history.
You're listening to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, your companion for cigar culture, whiskey wisdom, and everything in between. Want more? Visit us anytime at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com for articles, reviews, and pairing tips.
The irony of it is hard to miss. The man who adored Cuban cigars, who made sure his humidor was stocked, is the same man who made it illegal for Americans to buy them. Kennedy would enjoy his Petit Upmanns for years to come, while ordinary citizens turned to Dominican, Honduran, and Nicaraguan alternatives. In fact, the embargo reshaped the entire global cigar industry. Cuban exiles re-established brands like Romeo y Julieta, Montecristo, and Partagas outside of Cuba, creating parallel versions that still exist today. Trademark battles exploded in courts, and the legend of the forbidden Cuban only grew stronger with every passing year. And Kennedy's relationship with cigars wasn't just about politics. Friends and aides recalled smaller moments that captured his habits. He was known to leave half-smoked cigars in ashtrays when duty called him away suddenly. They became silent witnesses to the chaos of the Oval Office, symbolic pauses in a life lived at full speed. Then there's the lore of the CIA, which at one point brainstormed ideas to assassinate Fidel Castro. Among the more colorful proposals, a poisoned cigar, another plan, an exploding cigar. They never went beyond the planning stages, but they underline how deeply cigars were embedded in the Cold War imagination, symbols of power, luxury, and occasionally, danger. Even at the White House, cigars carried their own etiquette. That story of Kennedy lighting up as a signal to his guests is a small glimpse into how he used tobacco not just for personal enjoyment, but as a subtle tool of leadership. And so, when we look at this story, it's tempting to laugh it off as a quirky anecdote. However, the truth is that it reveals something important about power and humanity. Here was a president, juggling nuclear tensions, political enemies, and global crises, and yet he still thought about his cigars. Not as a selfish indulgence, but as something that grounded him, soothed him, and perhaps gave him clarity in the storm. Cigars are often called the thinking man's smoke. They're not rushed. They require patience. You light one when you want to slow time down, to think deeply, to savor. For Kennedy, that ritual may have been more important than we realize. In those quiet moments between the weight of history and the demands of the presidency, a cigar was both a comfort and a companion. And that's what makes this story more than trivia. The embargo Kennedy signed is still in place today, more than 60 years later. The Upmann Petit Corona he favored is still rolled in Havana, still enjoyed by cigar lovers around the world. And the tale of Kennedy's late-night cigar run continues to grow. Part fact, part legend, but all charm. It reminds us that history isn't just shaped in war rooms and press conferences. Sometimes it's shaped in smoke-filled lounges, in the quiet pull of a cigar, or in the hurried footsteps of a press secretary racing through Washington to buy out every tobacconist in town. This is the Cigar and Whiskey Guide podcast, and if you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more. Share it with a friend, leave a review, and join us again as we light up the stories where cigars, whiskey, and history all meet.
Thanks for listening to the Cigar and Whiskey podcast. Subscribe and share with a fellow aficionado, and keep the journey going at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com, where every puff and pour has a story.